Welcome to today's program. This is a four-part series and the third session in our four-part series with the Illinois Office of Broadband. This program is co-hosted by Illinois Extension. We're happy to have Matt Schmidt and his panel on for you today, and they're going to be sharing some next steps that communities need to be thinking about in regards to some of our earlier sessions on partnerships, technology choices, consultant support, and project rollout, and some of those other details relevant to broadband expansion and taking advantage of all of these ongoing opportunities. So thank you so much to our speakers today for making time and sharing your expertise. I'll let Matt give a brief introduction to orient everyone to our presenters. Thank you all for being here, and over to you, Matt.
Well, thank you, Nancy. Once again, it's a pleasure to join you, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. You've heard me say this before, but we have an historic opportunity for broadband infrastructure investment on our hands right now. And we wanted to do everything that we can to connect with communities across Illinois to help folks prepare to seize this opportunity. And so, as mentioned, this is the next in a series of webinar sessions featuring some resources and consultants that have been active in our Connect Illinois grant program here in Illinois. And so in a moment, you'll get to hear from them today. And as I've said it in the previous Fridays, my intention is for you to hear less of me today and more from them, and for us to have a really engaging Q&A session at the back end of the time together. And also just a heads up, I have my two little girls with me in the background today. Cleo and Isla both say hello. Usually the noon hour is safe for me, but today's not the case. And so if you hear a little voice chiming in, they just wanted to get their word in. But in any event, today we wanted to focus on the next steps, how to put together the previous content that we'd shared regarding kind of Broadband 101, all the jargon, the tech talk that goes along with broadband deployment and projects. And last week we talked about various approaches and partnership models. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach for communities, and really the nature of the kind of partnership that we see is evolving, and there's an approach that can work for any local community to solve their broadband access challenges. And so today we wanted to take that next step and focus on next steps with our communities, talking to our resources today about what communities can be doing to plan in light of the funding opportunities that are in front of us, and how we can use our time right now effectively moving forward. And so, as Nancy had mentioned, we do have an additional session coming up on Friday the 3rd, talking about our Accelerate Illinois Broadband Infrastructure Planning Program. We've talked a little bit about this in the past, but this is a program designed specifically to help local governments seize this opportunity. Think about how to leverage ARPA dollars, new infrastructure bill funding, or Connect Illinois dollars for building out broadband through partnerships or other approaches at that local level. And then I'm being optimistic here, but I think we're going to be able to speak in definitive terms about our Connect Illinois Round 3 Notice of Funding opportunity in December. And so I just put a little placeholder in here. Watch for additional news on word regarding Connect Illinois Round 3 funding in December, and we'll certainly follow up with details regarding a potential follow-along webinar. And so with that said, just wanted to spend a little bit of time in the coming slides here talking about the kind of resources that we're developing. One of them, I just mentioned, the Community-Driven Broadband Development Webinar Series, which you're a part of today. Tied to that is a specific program that we're looking to launch in the next week or two for local governments that would like to engage in an intense engagement with expert facilitation to talk about your community's vision for broadband expansion and how to leverage current ARPA dollars, American Rescue Plan Act dollars, future infrastructure bill dollars, or our existing Connect Illinois grant program, among other resources that are out there. So again, webinars are great, but if folks would like to take a deeper dive and have community-specific conversations about planning and seizing this moment, be on the lookout for this funding opportunity, a notice of collaboration opportunity, which will be posted soon through the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. Also, just wanted to mention that this webinar series, as great as it is, isn't the only show in town, and that we also had a great webinar session with our Illinois Connected Communities. Bill Coleman leading a panel this past Tuesday, November 16th. If you missed it, don't worry. Like all of these sessions, they're recorded and housed on our broadband website at University of Illinois Extension. So once again, thank you to Nancy and your colleagues for helping us put together this great curriculum and content, and for housing it for folks after the fact. So check out that session from November 16th if you missed it. We also have a similar session, Developing Broadband Leadership, that was, I think, a 7-part series over this past summer that is available on that same website. And so check that out. We'll make sure we drop a link. In fact, I see it just showed up right now. If you're catching this by YouTube, check out the comments. It'll be listed down there eventually too. And so, again, this is the slide that kind of speaks to that Developing Broadband Leadership series. And so 7-part series, the last one you can't see here, but it's there. And again, a great starting point for a lot of communities looking to, to learn a little bit about what they can do in the broadband realm. Another piece that I'd like to point to here, and we've spoken to this in past webinar sessions, is the investment that we've made in mapping in Illinois. And I don't think this necessarily gets the attention it deserves. This is a great resource for local communities that would like to take a look at, our best estimate right now of where broadband access is and is not. It's a great starting point for conversations about building up networks, expanding connectivity, leveraging public dollars in this historic moment to address local broadband goals and make your visions a reality. The Illinois Broadband Lab is a fledgling collaboration with the University of Illinois System and also the Benton Institute and others. And we will have over 1,700 PDF maps posted to this website, as well as a link to our fully interactive map. And so if you're a local community and you just want to get a sense as to where broadband is and is not in your local jurisdiction, this is a good starting point. Lots of great data collected from our providers in Illinois, double checked with field validation work, also input from at-home broadband speed test results, not to mention other data sets such as the American Community Survey that gets at adoption and affordability issues as well. And so this map is always going to be iterative. We'll always be improving it, but it's a great starting point for these conversations at the local level. So check that out. Again, we'll drop that link in the chat box here today, as well as post it in the comments on YouTube. And so that just brings us to a kind of an overview of what we'll be seeing in the slides ahead. All this funding that is available to us, our communities, for broadband expansion. Again, for decades now, we've known that there have been challenges at the local level throughout the state, throughout the country, not just in rural areas, but in areas that may have had digital redlining or other instances of underinvestment. And so through the collection of programs that are developing, we've got the opportunity to solve this infrastructure challenge once and for all. And so we've got the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, and the local fiscal recovery fund dollars. Those are dollars that are available directly to local governments. You do not need to apply for them, go through a grant process. They are there right now for you to use. Those are the best broadband dollars available for public-private partnerships that I'm aware of right now. And so ARPA dollars, great resource for community-driven broadband expansion. If you haven't checked that out or considered using them for broadband, now's a great time to have that conversation. And again, the planning program that we'll be launching here in the next couple of weeks will speak directly to that in the year 2022 through direct engagement with local communities. Also, we have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and Doug will be joining us here in a moment to talk in more detail about this program in particular, historic investment in broadband access and also digital equity. And so we'll learn more here in a few slides. Also, of course, our Connect Illinois grant program. When we launched this in 2020, it was the largest matching grant program in the country. And it's great to see so much federal investment in broadband catch other states up with Illinois. Every state has hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars for broadband now. And we look forward to announcing our round 3 of notice funding opportunity in the weeks ahead. So keep an eye out for that. And then finally, USDA Reconnect program. Doug will be speaking to that in more detail too. Details came online recently regarding that opportunity, and together with those listed above, a great mix of funding streams and partnership opportunities for our local communities, for them to be aware of, for them to seek partnership over. Again, and there's a tool to meet your needs. And I'm just giving you the highlights. There's much more detail in other supporting programs that add value to what's listed here. But I did want to follow up on the state and local fiscal recovery fund dollars, those ARPA dollars that are available directly to local communities. Again, these are the best broadband dollars in terms of, I think, your purchasing power it allows and in the, I guess, the strings attached, so to speak. And so for local governments that are interested, you go to the website here, we'll drop this link in, among others. You can scroll down and see what dollars are available to your county and to other local units of government. Just here in Illinois, $8 billion available to the state, counties over $2 billion, metro cities over $2.7 billion, and then non-entitlement units over $700 million. These are all funds that can be used for broadband. And I'll tell you folks, you don't need to use all of them for broadband to solve our challenges once and for all. And so I would really challenge our local communities to look at these dollars currently sitting in your accounts as a great way of kickstarting public-private partnerships around broadband expansion at the local level. I could go on and on about this, but I'll save it for now and pass the mic over to Doug Meredith from JSI Consulting. We're thrilled that you're able to join us today and provide some of your expert perspective on the lay of the land when it comes to infrastructure investment. So Doug, take it away.
Thank you very much, Matt, and good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I hope that the information that we prepared for your consideration today will be helpful and useful, and that we'll have hopefully have some dialogue or some conversation, maybe asynchronous, but conversation at the end. I just did want to emphasize what Matt just described. Two things came to mind. First of all, regarding mapping, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021 that we're going to be diving into to tell you what funds are available. But in addition to the funds, the FCC has been tasked by Congress to develop the map. And when I talk about the map, it's a broadband locations deployment map. And they have to do that by mid-2023. And it's really kind of a challenge because there's been some stumbles and fumbles with maps with the FCC in the past. And so, but they will be developing a map that is the definitive map of locations that have broadband capability in the country that have been that have used federal funds. So that's the hook for this particular map. And so that Illinois map, Matt, would be I think a great resource to have some discussion with the FCC on, and to give them some of your experiences and best cases for maps. The second item with regards to the ARPA money, the state and local fiscal recovery money, it's a big deal. I just want to put a exclamation point on what Matt was describing and the amounts of money that are available to state and local governments. The total amount of money in the state and local fiscal recovery fund is $350 billion. Some of the money, the first tranche of money has been distributed, and then in 2022 there will be another tranche of that $350 billion distributed, and that money can be used for a variety of projects, broadband being one of them. And we would encourage you at your county and municipal level, and then also in your NEU level, to take advantage of that money. I'm sure the state is working hard, and Matt's involved with that to figure out how to actually best deploy that state level money. But the sleeper is the other municipal level and the other government level monies that are available that you definitely want to look into and see what's available to you. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we'll just call it the Infrastructure Act, was signed by President Biden this last Monday, and so it is now the law of the land, and it has a number of various programs and grant programs and funding programs that we wanted to make sure you were aware of. Now, the notice of funding opportunity for these programs is not out yet. There's different schedules, and I'll be talking about that. Some of what the schedule is. But I did this particular material is for your consideration to put on your to-do list. as a next step, as to say, okay, I'm interested in this particular program, or I'm interested in that particular program, and you go to the various resources that I'll identify for you, and keep track of that. The next slide, we'll do the first slide, if you can shift to that. The first program that is the biggest program, because the Infrastructure Act has set aside 65, give or take a few million, $1 billion for broadband initiatives. This amount of money a lot of it goes to the supply side, and other monies go to the demand side. And when I talk about supply and demand, I refer back to when we were talking at Broadband 101. The supply is the infrastructure, and the demand is the use and the skill sets and the inclusion and the equity issues that are involved. And this act has money for both supply and demand. The bulk of the money is, of course, for the supply. And the bulk of that supply money goes to this particular program, the Broadband Equity Access Deployment Grant Program. It's been collapsed into BEAD or BEAD. It's the BEAD program, and it has a total of $42.45 billion available for grants. Now, the interesting thing, and a little bit of backstory for you, if you're new to the area, the broadband space has generally been a FCC, a Federal Communications Commission activity. They have high cost support programs. They have lifeline programs for low income households and so forth. FCC has been involved a lot with broadband. And then the US Department of Commerce has a National Technology Office Administration, and that's NTIA. Well, when COVID came around, and when the Consolidated Appropriations Act came around last year, NTIA plays a much larger role in distributing funds for the use of broadband. They had 3 different programs last year: the Broadband Infrastructure Deployment Grant Program, the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, and then a Connecting Minority Communities program. It was a pilot program. And those programs, they had notices notices for funding opportunities out, and 2 of the programs are completed. That means they got all the applications in and they're reviewing those. Just as an FYI, the Broadband Infrastructure Deployment Program had $288 million assigned to it. They had 230 applications for that money. And the total amount of applications, the total ask from those applications was $2.5 billion. So they had $288 million of supply, and they had $2.5 billion of demand for that particular program. And the tribal program as well, there was $980 million for tribal, and they had a $5 billion ask for it. So there's a huge need for this money, and NTIA has had a little bit of experience. And so one of the next steps that I'm giving you is, in order to prepare for the BEAD NOFO, which is going to be coming out in May of 2022, I would encourage you to go back to the Broadband Infrastructure Deployment Grant Program and read that NOFO. Read the information, what NTIA has done, because NTIA is going to be the administrator of the $45 billion program. And so it behooves you to understand what NTIA does, and what their NOFO was all about, how they actually developed the NOFO from the legislation, and then took that legislation, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, and turned it into a NOFO. Because then you can use that guidance to go to the Infrastructure Act, look at the BEAD section of the Act, and read that, and then forecast or predict what the NOFO is going to take, what form the NOFO is going to have. And I would encourage you to do that, because it will be very beneficial to you to kind of anticipate what's going to happen in the NOFO that's coming out in second quarter 2022. Each state is going to receive an initial $100 million for this particular grant program. And then the remaining funding will be distributed based on a formula that considers unserved areas. Unserved in this context is 25.3. So if you have service under 25.3, that's 25 megabits download speed and 3 megabits upload speed. If you have less than that, then you are considered unserved in today's world in 2021. You know, if we go into our Wayback Machine back into 2025 or 2005, 25.3 would be heaven sent, you know, but times have changed and speeds are increasing. And so the unserved areas will be 25.3. There's also another distinction that's important to understand, that when people talk about underserved areas, they talk about usually in a lot of grant programs, they're talking about something in the 100 range, 100 megabits down and 20 megabits upload. So you have unserved areas that are less than 25.3, and you have underserved at less than 100/20. Other programs use 100/100, meaning it's symmetrical 100 speeds. That would be the Reconnect that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. But those are the basic concepts: unserved and underserved. And so the rest of the money will be distributed upon unserved areas, using broadband data maps to be published by the FCC. So the FCC they actually have two map obligations. They have the map, which I talked about before, which is the broadband deployment map, locations map. That's ordered to be done by 2023. But there was also legislation earlier on that created the data map, the broadband data map from the FCC, and they're working on that. And they're in progress, and they're making progress on the broadband data map. So there's two FCC map proposals or map initiatives. This particular BEAD program will be using the older version, or the data maps, not the map. I feel like I'm in Dora the Explorer when we're talking about the map, but that is what it is. That map will be a definitive guide for all federal sources in 2023. The states will begin receiving these awards late 2022 and into 2023. Now, a particular note that I need to make: when we talked about this state and local fiscal recovery money that came out of the ARPA, and that Matt described and that I put exclamation point on, that was money distributed by Treasury directly to the states. And Treasury gave some guidance, but they left it wide open to the states. They said, you know, this is guidance, this is what we think you should do with the money, but your states, your big boys and girls, you can do what you want with the money, provided that it meets the statutory requirements. And so it'll be interesting as well to see how NTIA interfaces with states. If they're going to say, well, I'm going to give you guidance, or whether they're going to have a few more rules for this particular money that goes to the states in these bulk amounts. And the under 25.3 are given priority, and then the under 120 are eligible. So all of those areas are eligible, with a little leaning to the side of the unserved areas, the 25.3 areas. So hopefully that gives you some guidance on the broadband equity access and deployment grant program. So if we can step to the next slide. The next slide deals with middle mile. The FCC, or Congress, has recognized that there's a need to get from these unserved areas to the internet, the capital I internet, the internet backbone. And middle mile, if you recall our discussion in Broadband 101, we talked about middle mile. It's you have an area that's unserved, and then you have a connection from that area to a internet POP, point of presence, which is a connection into the internet backbone. That segment is called middle mile, and Congress says, well, we understand that there may be a need for some middle mile support, and they appropriated $1 billion for middle mile. This will be another program that is administered by NTIA. That's the U.S. Department of Commerce, NTIA. And if you go, you should go to their site because they have a wonderful, wonderful website. In the NTIA, they talk about all their grant programs, and there's a lot more detail with regards to what NTIA has done. So they have their Consolidated Appropriations Act material, and they also have the infrastructure, or they will have the infrastructure material in more detail than they have right now, a little bit later. The NOFO for middle mile is going to be May 2022. So next year, and funding will be awarded the following year, according to the schedules that we have from the Act. And this is specifically to expand middle mile infrastructure to reduce the cost of connecting unserved and underserved areas, those areas that we talked about, to the internet backbone. The interesting thing about this particular program is that it's really going to look like an open source network program, meaning the owner of this particular infrastructure will be required to have wholesale rates for other users, and will have open source capability. So it won't be it won't be just your pipe. If you get money from this program, it won't be your pipe. I should also note that when we talked about open network and so forth, a lot of these grants are going to be requiring what we call in the industry net neutrality principles, where you have no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization, and no discrimination for the service that you're providing. That's a topic that takes another hour to discuss, but just so you know, there are going to be obligations in many of the programs to make sure that the net neutrality principles are being adhered to with the money. And that program requirement will last as long as the infrastructure is in place. So when you're talking about fiber, you're talking about plus 20 years, you're committing to actually having no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization, and no non-discrimination for that the entire life of the plant. So pay attention to that particular provision when you're working it. It might not be, it might be a ho-hum issue for you, but for other providers, it becomes a very, very important issue. So, and we maybe, Matt, we can have a discussion about that, why that is, but that's for another day. So let's go to the next program. The Infrastructure Act actually appropriated more money to Reconnect. Now, Reconnect is administered by the USDA and U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it's a program that has a history. So they have already had 2 rounds of Reconnect money distributed. And this is for broadband deployment, and there's a whole host of regulations and rules that apply to these grant monies. What's important is that they just announced a week or 2 ago, I think probably 2 weeks ago, Reconnect 3. And Reconnect 3 was a 1.1x billion dollars, $1.1 billion, give or take a few million. What's a few million or a few billion among friends? That's kind of the story, because we have money everywhere going on here. So about $1.1 billion was assigned to the Reconnect 3 program. The interesting characteristic of the Reconnect 3 is that they are requiring symmetric 100 speed, so that the service that is being funded out of Reconnect 3 is 100 megabits down and 100 megabits up, so symmetric 100 speed. And there's also other issues of eligibility that have changed with Reconnect 3 as well. But the Infrastructure Act gives another $2 billion to Reconnect. And so we have a program for this fiscal year. So the fiscal year ending next September 30th, the fiscal year, federal fiscal years may follow what your state and locals do. It's October to September, and that's the fiscal year for the federal government. And so the end of 2022, September is when this money is to be distributed. So there'll be this. One, they could supplement the Reconnect 3 and actually increase the amount, or they might have a Reconnect 4 very soon following the Reconnect 3 program. So there's a lot of money from the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the Reconnect program for this for this. And the Congress directs them to actually use 120, at least 120. Well, with Reconnect 3, they actually said it was 100. And so my bet, if I had to put money on the roulette table, I would say that they'll probably stay with 100 with this new, because it does satisfy the congressional directive to be above at least 120. Next slide, please. The next program that is that I want to talk about a little bit is the Affordable Connectivity Program, or the ACP program. This is a demand side program. So take your infrastructure building hat off and think about customers for a minute. Think about who uses the network. The Consolidated Appropriations Act last year appropriated $3.2 billion to what is called the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. This program was administered by the FCC, not NTIA, but FCC, and it's very much parallels in flavor or in spirit the Broadband Lifeline program that the FCC has. Anyway, the EBBP was a program to say, okay, during COVID for low-income qualifying households, and there's a lot of mechanisms to qualify. For those qualifying households, we will award a $50 per month credit to pay their broadband bill for a qualifying broadband service, $50 credit per month, and during COVID or until the money runs out. And we'll also provide a device credit of $100 if you have to pay, if you buy a device that costs between $10 and $50. You know, if for the user it's a $10 and $50 charge, then $100 gets kicked in from the program. What the Infrastructure Act does is that it modifies and expands the EBBP. The EBBP will now become the ACP, and the FCC just either yesterday or the day before released a public notice on to actually formulate the rules. Those rules have to be done very, very quickly. Comments are due on the 8th of December, and the replies are due the end of December, and then the program actually starts in January. What the Infrastructure Act did was it made it more permanent. It took out the COVID provisions, and it said, this is ACP, we're going to have this for a longer period of time. $14.2 billion was appropriated and to the FCC to actually distribute the money. Non-tribal monthly household benefit goes from $50 during COVID to a $30 amount after, in the ACP program, with a small provision that is kind of, it's perplexed me since I've been reading the act for a while. It's perplexed me as to how the FCC was going to handle the matter. And it was in high-cost areas, if providers have a particularized economic hardship, they can actually get up to $75 for their customers in that particular area. How the FCC is going to do that is unknown, and they really don't know either. They're asking for comments on how they would actually do that enhanced support, because the tribal benefit is at $75, and so you have the non-economic hardship area is $30, and then they have a provision where if you're in a rural area that's defined by NTIA, and then you have economic hardship as a provider, then you can actually get between $30 and up to $75, and then tribal areas are $75. The other key issue here is the eligibility for income eligibility qualification changes from 135% of the poverty level to 200%. That means that in a household of 4, qualification threshold for this program will now be $53,000 of annual income, household income. So anyone 63,000 or less, a household of 4 would be eligible for this program. So it expands the number of households that would be eligible. And the rules are going to be issued this year. The FCC is seeking comments right now that are due, and then the transition will occur in the first quarter of 2022. There's 60 days to move people from the $50 to the $30. So we'll have $50 for essentially 2 months into the 2022, and then it goes to the next level. Generally, it will be $30. Next slide. There's also some demand issues. There's a state digital equity capacity competitive grant programs. There's several components of this. Very, very important. The Congress wants states to develop digital equity plans. And they've appropriated $60 million to have the states and the broadband deployment offices of those states develop a digital equity plan. Then when a state has a digital equity plan, then they can go to 2 grant programs. $1.4 billion is for the digital equity capacity grant, and 1.25 is for the digital equity competitive grant. And this is to promote the achievement of digital equity and support digital inclusion activities and build capacity for states related to broadband adoption. And then the competitive grant is to achieve digital equity and spur greater adoption of broadband among covered populations. And rural areas, residents in rural areas are in cover the population definition. So there's 1.4 for generally, and then $1.25 billion for particular population, covered populations, and rural areas are considered covered population. So when we get, and so that particular area, that's for demand, for adoption, for digital equity and inclusion. Those types of programs have money as well on the demand side. Next slide. And that covers the highlights. This bill is huge. It's $1 trillion bill, but that covers the highlights that I wanted to talk to you about today. There are a number of other items that are important, and well, let me just note one of them. The FCC is directed by Congress to create a broadband label, nutrition label is what we've been describing it in the industry. In 2016, the FCC started this program, started the looking into it, and then abandoned it. They set it aside. And it's essentially a nutrition label to give customers a quick fact sheet of the service, the broadband service that they're receiving. And that particular fact sheet is now, that broadband nutritional label, the broadband label, is now coming up again. And the FCC has been given the responsibility to actually create a regulation requiring broadband providers to have these consumer labels by November 2022. So next year, the FCC will be addressing that particular issue. The challenge for a broadband provider with a nutritional broadband label is that the service speed, for example, can vary depending upon your location. And so you might have one product that can deliver service in a particular area, but there are pockets of that area that can get better speeds, and there are pockets that get less speeds. That's why a lot of providers use up to a certain speed, rather than saying, I'm guaranteeing you, a certain speed. They usually advertise up to a certain speed because their advertising goes across the entire geography where you have these heterogeneous pockets of speed differences. Well, how the FCC is going to address that is going to be what to watch for, because they need to have this broadband label for a product that they're selling, but the product that they're selling has some variation in it. So that's the challenge. So with that, I think we turn it. I don't know, Matt, if you're going to move directly to Christy, or if what you want to do.
Sure. Thanks so much, Doug. That was great. What an overview there. And I think a lot of fodder for future discussion. And so thank you for teeing up those issues. Next, we have Christy Zabel from Vantage Point Solutions. And Christy, thanks so much for joining us today. Take it away.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Douglas. So I'm going to really shift gears now from from the overview of what Douglas just went through on the funding and focusing, okay, now we know that there's funding coming down the pipe. There's a lot of funding coming down the pipe. So what can you be doing now to get ready to maximize on those funding pieces? So what I'm going to do is, one thing that we've learned and what we've heard, and it's just kind of disheartening, is when these funding programs open up, the application opens, and then it's like, oh my gosh, we need to make sure we're taking advantage of these dollars. And really, if you're waiting until once the funding opportunity, the NOFA comes out to start talking about where you want to go, what you want to do, and how you're going to secure these fundings, you're really too late. The steps that you're doing now by joining these weekly sessions that have been hosted by the Illinois Broadband Office is the right thing. So kudos to you again for giving of your time, especially over your lunch hour. So I'm going to run through these. I know we're coming up about 15 minutes to 1 o'clock. I know we've got flexibility for time, but I want to be cognizant of your time as well. So Nancy, I've got animations in here, so I apologize. So I'll try to cue you when to hit the next button. But what I'm going to focus on is, in a perfect world, everybody has gone through the work. You've met with your boards, you've met with your community leaders, and you've got a strategic plan on your desk. I reference on your desk because if you're like me, and if you can see my visual here, on the back of my desk on my shelves, I've got binders, I've got books, but I am focused forward. I'm not looking back, I'm focusing forward. So you have that strategic plan on your desk. You're constantly looking at it. It's fresh in your mind and you're not ignoring it and forgetting about it. And what I mean on that is we're looking at both our short-term opportunities for growth and also our long-term growth opportunities. So when you're looking at your community, and if you're a community leader or if you are an actual service provider, where do you want to be within the next 12 months, 24 months? What we've seen with a lot of these funding programs is you have to have an obligation to get it built out. You have to have an obligation to begin providing service within a 24-month window, or potentially up to something longer, where a long-term growth opportunity would be from a 5-year perspective. With the infrastructure bill that is now law that Douglas went over, we know we've got until 2026. Want to be, and the last big bullet I have on this slide is think big. So don't look at just small little nuggets of where you want to be, what you want to do. Think big. When we see with all of the different programs, overall, they've got a similar characteristic as far as what the obligation, the build out, the procurement rules that are all going to be associated with it. So if you think big, start out large, whether it's the whole community, it's the whole county, or you want to go into the neighbor counties. And as the programs are coming out, you're able to start carving out from that big picture to get a program and a project that would fit exactly what you're going to be looking for applying. So the next slide is then we focus on, okay, we've got our strategic plan. We know where the county wants to be, where the community wants to be, and where, if I'm a service provider, where my company wants to be. We've gotten through the strategic plan. And so now let's think out what that network plan is going to look like. So from this perspective, we're talking about the program, if it's 100 meg symmetrical, if it is something faster, if there's incentive to do a gig. Are you going to be doing a fiber layout? So you're going to be looking at building out fiber throughout the community, throughout the county. If so, what is that going to really cost you? We know from a build perspective that fiber is not a cheap investment. It's a pretty costly investment, but you're also getting a 30-year life asset and then some. So yes, you're making a big investment in typically on these areas where the funding is going to fit. They haven't been built out yet because of the fact of the price tag on that fiber layout. Then if we look at the next one, if we're utilizing aerial build, are we doing a buried build? Again, there's going to be a cost difference between which type of construction is going to be getting done. If you're doing aerial, what is going to be that make ready cost if you have to attach to other poles? So that's our next bullet we need to make sure we're taking into consideration. Make ready is going to be the investment that you're going to have to incur if you're latching on to an existing utility pole. So is that pole going to be structurally sound in order to support an additional fiber cable getting hung on there? And then engineering design is my next bullet that we have on there. A lot of the programs do require a commitment that you're going to be building out, whether it's 100 meg symmetrical or something different, making sure that you worked with the licensed engineer to ensure that your design that will be getting done to meet the build out obligations and to meet the program requirements actually can do that. Some programs actually require you to have a certification from a licensed PE to be included with the application. And then the last bullet on this slide here is, okay, who's going to be the service provider? We talked last week, if you joined us, in regards to that public-private partnership, where as a community or county, you don't have to necessarily be the one to go out and secure the funding and build the network and be the internet service provider. You can partner with that, but it's having those conversations. So again, when the program opens up and the application windows up, you've had those conversations. You know what that arrangement is going to look like. So you're not starting from scratch, because that does take time. You want to make sure you're getting into a partnership with an entity where you've got common vision, common goals, common metrics, common methodologies of a mindset on how you want to provide service. So go to the next slide. Again, then in a perfect world, we've gotten the strategic plan. We've got the network design. We know who we're going to be partnering with. If we are partnering, we know who's going to be doing the service provider. Now comes the time of actually, okay, what's it going to cost us to do this? What's my capital expenditure going to be? So when we look at our cost to build, going back to how we designed our network, are we doing buried, aerial, fiber? What's our make ready? All of those components are going to go into our overall design. What are the services that we are wanting to offer is the next one. Primarily, the funding that's coming out is for broadband. So you are making a commitment to deliver broadband to the end user, those residents, those businesses, those anchor institutions. Broadband is the main component. There are some programs out there that may require a voice component, but typically with these grant dollars, it's focused primarily on broadband. And then the build out obligations. So when you look at what the program is going to require you to have everything constructed and built out, we've all heard the supply chain issues. We've heard the labor shortage issues. That all comes into play on what you could potentially be looking at for the cost to build out your network. We see the programs, they understand that it's an issue, but making sure you take that into consideration if it's going to be a higher cost. Supply and demand goes back to our basic economics classes that we had. And then prevailing wage, that is a big component. State of Illinois, you guys have the prevailing wage in the Connect Illinois program, but just making sure going into developing what it's going to cost to build out, that if the program that you're applying for requires a prevailing wage, strong labor conditions, or even if the Davis-Bacon labor requirements come into play, that will have an impact as well on what your cost is to build out the network. So the next slide, this is the financial feasibility. In my role, I am a financial analyst, a consultant, accountant. I like financials. I like running the spreadsheets. So hopefully you all have a strong financial person in your entity organization that runs forecasts, that runs budgets. But this really is the only way that you're going to be able to identify what truly is the need for funding assistance. So the financial feasibility, we can just bounce through these next bullets all at the same time. You're primarily going to be looking at it from a project specific view. So when we're applying for funding, looking at just the project, typically it's either a 5-year or a 10-year view that you want to see. 10-year really gives you a good view of the application. May only want a 5-year, but if you stretch it out to a 10-year view, you're going to see what's going to happen in those latter years. Typically, if you've got a 5-year construction project, you're building, you're going heavy in those first few years, the numbers probably aren't going to look that rosy. But then once you get beyond that year 5 and you're in year 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, the view should hopefully be a positive, especially if you're getting grant funding to help with that build. Your feasibility should making sure that you're taking into account both your capital expenditure estimates, your operating expense estimates, and then what are you going to get from an end user perspective for the revenues. And then ultimately, we're doing this because this is going to show us what our funding needs are going to be and what we're going to want to request or need to request in the funding programs that come out. The next slide. This is one that really I can't stress enough. As community leaders and service providers, this is the time when you really need to be engaged with each other. Start having those conversations if you haven't already. This has a huge impact on developing your economic development piece. Where are you as a community seeing? Are you having out migration of people because there's not a solid broadband connectivity in your community? Identifying what the needs are, what the overall impact is going to be by being a service provider. So if you want to hit the next advance on the slides here to get my next 3 bullets up. This really all starts with having a cup of coffee with each other. If coffee is your thing, if Diet Coke or Diet Pepsi or something else is your thing, engaging in those conversations. We saw this summer with the NTIA broadband infrastructure program where that government entity or a subdivision of the state had to be the applicant. We had coming late to the game saying, wow, I said, we didn't know that our community, which is, a county next door, really had a need. We could have fit that. We could have worked together to do an application. Where if you're having those conversations now, just reaching out, you may see that there's a huge opportunity for you and the service provider together. So next slide. And I'm trying to watch. I don't see any chats. But again, if you have questions for either myself or Doug, please send that in the chat and we'll make sure and address that. I won't go into a lot of detail on here. Douglas talked about the maps and where we're going for sure on the BEAD program, the infrastructure bill that's coming out. But right now, until we have that map, when you're looking at the different funding programs and whether that be Connect Illinois program, the USDA Reconnect program, where it really does fall on the applicant to identify the eligibility, you're going to want to use the best mapping that's available. So the image I have here is a US image of the FCC. That's the 477, which broadband providers have to file semi-annually, identifying where they are delivering and advertising that they can deliver broadband. Again, the definitions, we've got unserved where you're lacking, the broadband cannot be accessed at a 25 meg by 3 meg. And with this, they're really looking at terrestrial broadband. So if you happen to be in an area where you've got a satellite provider, their technology is not deemed as a terrestrial. So we think if you're going in for funding, you should easily be able to compete in an area where a satellite provider is the only one. And then underserved is anything between 25 meg down, 3 meg up to 100 meg down, 20 meg up, and you can't get that speed. And again, the onerous falls on the applicant to make sure you're valid with an eligibility perspective. The next slide, when we look at applying for funding, these are the thoughts. We've already kind of talked about this in a prior slide, but making sure that you're having those conversations and starting to come up with that engineering layout. If you are an existing provider or you're partnering with an existing provider, making sure you're ready to define and describe what the existing network looks like, how you're going to connect to your proposed network, and then what are the design parameters that were used in engineering the system. Should there be any licenses if you were going after a fixed wireless deployment, if the area just does not pan out from a financial perspective on doing fiber, but there's an option for a wireless? Is there anything that's required from a spectrum licensing perspective? Partnering with an entity, do you have those agreements in place with who you're going to be partnering with as a service provider to construct and engage in the program? And then how are you going to operate the network? Is there any type of agreement that you would need to have from an operational perspective? Network diagram, all of the programs are going to want to see what it's going to look like if they're giving you millions of dollars. What's it going to look like? So that's your network diagram. And strongly recommend that your system design is prepared by a registered engineer who is licensed in the project area state. A licensed PE certification included with your application holds a lot of weight, especially when you're looking at a program with significant speed obligations for your build out. Environmental compliance, golly, we could talk a lot on this. It really depends on the program that you're applying for. Anything with federal is going to want to make sure that you're not harming any environmental. You're working with the right agencies at both the federal level and the state level from an engineering compliance. With the RUS, USDA, that is a pretty heavy load to make sure that your project is not going to disrupt any endangered flowers or weeds or any birds or insects. So that can be a pretty big component. And again, we could talk about that quite a bit more. My next slide is just a refresh of the feasibility. Like I said on the prior slide, typically you're going to be looking at providing either a 5-year up to a 10-year financial forecast. The Connect Illinois program is a 10-year forecast. It was in the last round. I haven't seen the details yet on the round 3, but basically you're proving the sustainability of the project. And then it depends on whether you're doing a consolidated or a standalone based on the requirements of the program. We talked earlier here with Douglas on the NTIA BIP. That was a standalone project. RUS, the Reconnect, is a total consolidated of the applicant. But primarily what you're looking at submitting as part of your application would be your income statement, your balance sheet, and your cash flow. Again, making sure that you can prove that the project is sustainable with the grant funds and that they're not going to be allocating grant dollars and the plan still doesn't make financial sense going forward. Making sure that whatever program you would be looking at getting funding for, that you've gone through and you've understood what the potential covenants to be met would be with obtaining those grant funds. Each program is different when it comes to the potential covenants on that, but just making sure you do your homework, knowing what those are going to be before you enter into the actual application. Most programs, they want to know the narrative to support your grant request. So providing, information as far as why the funding is needed, what went into your basis for forecasting the way you did. There's typically a requirement to provide audited financials to show that the applicant who's going to be using the funds and providing the service is financially sound to begin with. And then what that matching contribution is going to be. Is there a matching contribution? Some programs do require anywhere from 50% up to 10%. Some programs also allow you to do no matching contributions. So depending on what the program is and what that requirement is. So if there is a matching contribution, that you can show that you've got the funds on hand or you will have those funds secured in order to hit your match piece. The next one, as I said, most of the programs have commonalities as far as what's going to go into the application. But I just kind of wrote out here the main components that we see. Dependent on the program rules, the network build and the system design, again, a PE that's licensed in the state that you've worked with to come up with that. The budget development, so you'll include your capital expenditure cost. You'll need to break that down to fiber, any make-ready engineering, the electronics that are going to be required to actually light that fiber and provide service. What type of equipment is going to be needed at the customer, the end user's location to connect it into their home or their business. All of that would need to be detailed and broken out. The pro forma, that's your financial forecast. Regulatory assistance, should you be a brand new provider, is there requirements in the state that you obtain authority to be a broadband provider? Anything from ETC status, the list could be going on, but just making sure whatever the requirements of the program are, you are aware of that ahead of time before submitting and being awarded those dollars. And then most programs do have an ongoing reporting requirement. So they're giving you dollars. There's going to be an obligation to report where you've built, how you've built, that you've delivered the broadband speeds to the locations that you're committing to. Federal programs would potentially require you to report into the hub and then do performance measurement testing. So making sure that you're ready for that as well. I am a financial person, but the next few slides really shows I am passionate as well as not just making sure you're submitting an application that makes financial sense, but really the overall impact that broadband brings to your communities is amazing. I consider myself very fortunate. I live in a city in South Dakota. We've been fiber to the home since 2005. So my kids, when they were going through school, never had to worry about having issues going home and working on their homework because we had a computer, we had fiber connectivity. When COVID hit, the number of locations that really struggled with getting broadband, unfortunately, but fortunately, is why we are seeing this influx of the billions of dollars with the broadband infrastructure in place, because it took a pandemic for the budgets to get adjusted to where broadband infrastructure is no longer a want, it's not a luxury, it's a necessity. So when you're looking at your area, identify what the proposed funded service area. Our industry loves acronyms, so I apologize. You've heard a lot of acronyms over the past few weeks, but the PFSA is your proposed funded service area. What are the economic characteristics? A big push for poverty levels if you're seeing out migration, educational challenges, the ability for our kids and our college kids and our professors to do distance learning, distance teaching from home, healthcare needs, our telehealth, in-home healthcare, public safety. These are all identified as our main community core anchor institutions and how that hits those who are not having broadband at their homes. The next one is looking at making sure you're partnering with someone who's got the management and operational experience. So if you can hit the next two slides, here's one thing that, as a service provider who currently is providing broadband, one thing we don't necessarily like to do is have our staff, our key management people refresh their resumes and have an updated bio on hand. But really, that's what's going to be your telling story, that you are partnering, you're working with someone who understands the industry, understands the business of providing broadband, operating and maintaining those networks. And then if they've gone through additional grant programs, they've got that experience, and then overall experience in providing those services. So those are all pieces that would get put in the application to show that you are partnering with an entity that understands and knows the ins and outs of being a broadband provider. And then my last slide that I have is just a refresh of, yes, there's a lot of dollars out there. There's a lot of opportunities. You're all doing the right thing now by having the conversations and coming to these webcast sessions that are being held. But as you're looking at the programs, making sure that you understand what those covenants and what those restrictions are. Each program is going to be different. Again, commonalities amongst them, but overall, those procurement, the application, your build out obligations, the financial covenants, is there going to be a lien that's going to be put on those assets that are getting funded with federal or state dollars? What are the reporting obligations post award or during build out of the award? What are the potential Davis-Bacon? Again, that's our prevailing wage impacts. Procurement requirements. Are you going to have to submit all of these projects out to bid? Federal programs has a Buy American clause to it, so making sure that you understand on that. Overall, as we're looking at these areas that truly are unserved and underserved today, there's a reason it's costly. So funding assistance is very, very beneficial to the overall build of the project. But just make sure that you're doing your due diligence on what those requirements are that's going to come with that funding. Yes, there's requirements and yes, there's obligations, but they are manageable and they are able to be navigated as long as you know going into what you're going to be walking into. So you're prepared to help navigate through that and ultimately be successful in getting the funding and then building up broadband to the areas where they're needed. So with that is all I have. I think I went a little bit over 1 o'clock. I tried to go through that quickly, so I apologize if I went too fast. But you've got our contact information, so feel free to reach out with questions. And if you have questions now, I don't know if we see questions in there.
Thank you,
Thanks so
Chris.
much, Christy and Doug. And I think what a thorough overview for folks. And I think we all spoke longer than we were planning to. And so hopefully that's to everybody's benefit. Nancy, I'll hand the mic over to you. If there are any questions, we can go through some Q&A. Otherwise, I just thank everybody for your interest in this topic, and certainly Doug and Christy and Nancy for making today's discussion and overview possible.
Yes, there was an early question with Doug Meredith when he was giving his presentation. Will the 100 million for each state go to the states themselves to distribute, or is this just earmarked for applicants in each state?
Good question. No answer to that. I would expect it to go to the states for distribution, but we have to wait for the NOFO from NTIA on that. It's, as I mentioned, this is a little different than the local, state and local fiscal recovery, because that money came from Treasury. And so now we're coming from NTIA, and that's an open question for the NOFO.
Thank you for that. I don't see any other questions, but I'm wondering if there are any lasting comments from either presenter.
Well, I just want to emphasize that what Christy gave you was exceptional in the steps to go through the programming. And it's important for you all to understand that doing early preparation is very important, and getting engineering on board is very important to start with. And so there's plenty of resources out there in the industry for that. And so you should take advantage of those now, because engineers of this particular type, as you know, there's money everywhere, and there's going to be a lot of demand for those engineering resources. And so you want to make sure you have your skill set and your team together well before the NOFO comes out, with preliminary discussions. And so starting now, what Christy said is very, very important.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you again. I realize it's hard to break away. We're all busy, but we appreciate the opportunity, Vantage Point, and I know JSI does as well, to join you. We've enjoyed our time. So yeah, if there's any other opportunities or questions that you may have, please let us know. But it definitely is a busy time. And if you've been giving any type of consideration to doing broadband, boy, now is the time to really start hitting the trail and doing the full due diligence and the homework. And if it makes sense, be prepared for when those funding programs open up. We won't see this level of dollars coming at us every year.
Many thanks to both of you, and also to Matt for organizing our wonderful presenters today. You guys have some thank yous in the chat that folks are passing along to you. I want to say on behalf of everyone that this is just so very helpful. I'll be sending the follow-up information shortly this afternoon. Save those dates for December 3rd, 17th, and even on January 11th for our adoption discussion. Thanks again, and I hope everyone has a great weekend, and best of luck. We'll see you on December 17th.